Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, we are reintroducing Proles Pod. They are back on the scene. They're revamped, renewed, renovated, and we're talking with Jeremy, Ray, and Tony from the new version of Proles Pod about a bunch of different things. We talk about Marxism. We talk about wonderful comrades and historical movements of the Marxist tradition in the past. We talk about various criticisms and things that we find promising about the international and North American left. We talk about the world today, the crisis that the United States is in domestically and imperially abroad. Talk about important traits that revolutionaries should try and consciously cultivate, and so much more. These are all really wonderful, thoughtful human beings and comrades talking about this tradition that we all are in and that we all love and value and we want to see succeed in the world, which is that of socialism, of Marxism, and ultimately of communism. So this is a really, really fun episode with three people that genuinely bring unique perspectives. And that's something I mentioned in the show, is that, this new revamped version of Proles Pod is really interesting because all the people involved, they do have unique perspectives. They place their emphases in unique places, but they all come together to form a really coherent and really principled Marxist-Leninist podcast and educational outlet. So this is a really fun one. I really hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope you go subscribe and listen to Proles Pod. It's a great show. They're great people. I knew the old Proles personally. I've just met some of the newer members, but I've always been close with them. They've always been close with us, and so there's always been a connection there, and I'm really excited to see them coming back in a new and evolved form. And before we get into the show, if you like what we do here at Rev Left Radio, you can support the show directly. We're 100% listener funded, always have been, always will be. You can support us at patreon.com/Rev Left Radio. And in exchange for only a couple dollars a month, you get access to a backlog of over 300 bonus episodes, as well as new bonus episodes every single month. So it's a really great way to support the show, and I try to give back in the form of really, hopefully, engaging and interesting Patreon content. So thank you so much to everybody that supports the show. Without further ado, here is our conversation with Jeremy, Ray, and Tony from Proles Pod. Enjoy.
So I'm Jeremy. I guess I'm representing the old school Proles on this call. I was obviously there at the beginning, the inception of the first iteration of Proles, and I'm happy to be back.
My name is Tony. I am, I guess, the first of the new class of Proles Pod. I'm a Black Canadian. I live in Canada, Marxist-Leninist, as you can imagine, being a member of Proles Pod. Given the geographical location, me being located in Canada, it might seem strange to the original listeners of Proles Pod who may know that the original podcast was based on a group of friends who live in a specific city in Colorado. I might seem like a bit of a random addition, but let me just give you a quick rundown of how I got involved with the podcast. So it was about maybe 6 or 7 months ago that Justin reached out to me. Apparently, he'd felt inspired to bring back Proles Pod in part because of the other podcast which I host, which is called Actually Existing Socialism, which is a very much a different show than Proles Pod, but it has quite a specific goal in mind. On that show, I speak to people who have live in, or who have studied extensively a socialist country. So I've had awesome guests like Gerald Horn, Kel Walsh, Henry Hucklemacki. I've also had the privilege to speak to people who've lived in, who've had deep experiences living in socialist countries, such as Victor Grossman, who's an American who defected to East Germany in the 1950s, and Monica Macias, who is an African woman who actually grew up in North Korea as the ward of Kim Il-sung. So definitely check that out if you have the time. But anyways, that's the reason I was called up to be part of the new Proles group. I'm very excited to be a part of it. It's been great working with everyone so far. And I guess I'll hand it over to Ray, who's the other addition to our new group.
Hi, I'm Ray, and I am half of the two newest Proles. Which is myself and my husband. I am American, but I live in not America with my not American husband. I was a Proles head from the way back, And I believe, frankly, that I manifested my way to the Roundtable, because a few weeks before they put out the call for new hosts, I was speaking with some friends of mine, some solid comrades who came to visit us. And, you know, every group of friends, I mean, I guess Jeremy knows well, but every group of friends sits around and they're like, man, guys, we should really make this into a podcast. And I was like, do you guys remember Proles at the Roundtable? And we were like talking about it, you know, reminiscing about the episodes. Like, man, I wish that show came back. And like, I was such a fan that my Patreon was still subscribed to Proles Pod.
Nice.
And so I got the message that they were looking for new hosts within minutes. And I drafted the email and I got ready to send it. And I asked my husband if he would also be willing to participate in the project. And he was like, yes, absolutely. Thank God, because he has audio editing experience, which I do not have. And I sent the email, and somehow I guess they could not find anyone better. So here I am.
That's awesome.
They were awesome. And like, to all the people that we did interview, because I'm sure they're probably going to be listening to this, it was a very difficult decision, but I guess just based on Ray and Martine's background and their experiences, and you know, we just we couldn't go elsewhere.
But yeah, we do hope to have those people who did interview with us to join us on some episodes in the future. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds great. And I'm so happy that the show is back. I'm so happy that it's revamped. Seems like you got a really great roster going forward. Huge shout out to Actually Existing Socialism, that podcast. I'll make sure to link that in the show notes along with the new Proles Pod link as well. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into it, because this is super exciting to have the show back. And I hope you guys can kind of talk a little bit about why you decided to return, what the differences are with the new Proles Pod compared to the old, Proles of the Roundtable, which we've touched on a little bit. Maybe you can go deeper in, and kind of what you have planned for the show going forward.
Yeah, so we did do like a reintroduction episode, and if you want to get like the full rundown from top to bottom of everything that we're doing differently and why we decided to come back and all of this, you can certainly get the full story there. But kind of in brief, the Reader's Digest version or whatever, there were a series of events that happened, it's coming up on like a year ago now, that kind of, I kind of assumed that everybody who was formerly a part of Proles were so, like, the rift was so great that there was no chance that if we came back, that would be something that everybody was cool with. And so when these events happened, I kind of approached everybody. And when I say everybody, I mean literally everybody who was a part of the original roster of Proles, but also everybody who was sort of secondary, tertiary related to the original project, and talked to them. And some people, if they had said, no, I don't support this, I'm not okay with this, then I would have just called it at that point. But as I kind of moved through the list, literally everybody kind of gave their blessing. Some were more enthusiastic than others. We've had Taylor on one of the episodes already, so he was definitely on board fully. Others were sort of had some trepidation about it. They were like, I have these concerns. You need to make sure that you don't allow animosity to build up within the group. You need to make sure that you have a plan for dealing with conflict, stuff like that. Those sorts of concerns, not like, I hate you and don't do this, but like, be careful, don't make the same mistakes we made the last time, which I think was pretty cool. So that's why we sort of started looking into coming back. The things we're going to do differently are, we no longer drink on the podcast, which probably makes us less fun, but also probably also more thoughtful, less stupid, I guess. But we have talked about like doing some kind of a throwback episode where we do drink on the podcast, but it just I think it wasn't healthy for us, because we were recording at that time 2 regular episodes a month, 1 bonus episode a month. We also did this RPG podcast with Ethan, and so that was 4 weekends a month, and alcohol was involved in all of them, and that's not super healthy, I think. It sort of encouraged bad behavior. So we decided to put that aside. We are also kind of shifting away from exclusively history, although that's going to be still the primary focus, towards discussing aspects of culture and modern sort of recent politics. Ray and Martine both contributed to and put together this really great episode on AMLO, the most recent elections in Mexico, kind of the history of Mexican politics up to this point. And, some of that was history, but a lot of it was more focused on recent events. And then Tony did a really great episode on X-Men 97. He and Justin are big X-Men nerds. So that was a really great thing that we did, but it is a little bit different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeremy, we're not nerds, we're enthusiasts.
Oh, right. Sorry. X-Men enjoyers is what I meant.
Absolutely.
So I'm actually a nerd, and this might sound kind of counterintuitive to those listening, considering that I am a communist history podcaster now, but I actually really struggled with a lot of history texts, especially those that are, heavy on like names and dates and chronological order, which I guess is most of what history is. But it's just really hard for me to connect with information that is presented in that way. Mm-hmm. And this made me feel really stupid and insecure. And eventually, it kind of dawned on me that if I struggle with this, others might as well. So another one of the changes that we've made in expanding the scope is to offer study guides that are available for every full episode on the main feed. They're free. They're on the Patreon, but you don't have to pay to subscribe. They're just there for you. And so that's another way that we're just trying to really examine in this go of the Proles Pod, what purpose can podcasts serve, and can we make it as easy as possible for people to retain information, to develop their own critical analysis, and, shock and awe, to use these episodes as a way to actually have discussions or conversations with other people in their lives. So that's like also kind of a little thing that we've added.
Yeah, I think that was a great innovation. That it was Ray's idea. Absolutely, like full credit there. And I think it's a great one because not only is it going to help people to retain information, but also if people are listening together, what a great way to start a discussion. As far as like what's coming up in the future, we're going to do, I guess, kind of a soft announcement. This is probably the place to do it. We are approximately 6 years after the Rev Left Stalin episode that Justin and I did.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing an entire series on Stalin because I think when we did that, it was very limited in terms of our scope and how much preparation we did, how much reading. So we are going to go very, very in depth, and we're going to do multiple episodes, and it's going to kind of be divided by sort of segments of Stalin's life and experience. But I think that'll be really interesting, hopefully, for people to check out.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's very exciting. I mean, the Stalin ep is still, to this day, by far, our most downloaded episode of all time.
Which is crazy.
It's crazy. It comes with, people that hate listened, people that love listened.
Yeah.
But it left a huge impact, and it really shook up the left, in all different ways at the time. I'm still proud of it. I'm still happy we did it, but I'm really excited to see all of you comrades revisit it and go into, even more depth. That is super exciting. I do have to say I really respect, your shift away from the drinking. It was a fun part of the show, but I totally understand with the amount of content you're putting out that it becomes too much. One of the moments that I have in my head that I still remember is when I came to Colorado to meet up with everybody one of the times. It was actually one of my most embarrassing moments, although I'm sure you guys have totally forgotten it. But we were all hanging out. We were like kind of drinking, and you busted out this nice whiskey, and you were pouring glasses for everybody. And I asked for a chaser because I'm, kind of a little bit. That's where I come from. That's how I was drinking at the time. And you guys all like in a loving way broke out laughing. Like, this is not whiskey that you use with a chaser. And it's always stuck with me. And when I came back to Omaha, I made it a point to become a guy who can drink whiskey without a chaser. So, a small thing, but I think it's a funny thing.
That was probably I don't remember who brought out the whiskey.
Yeah.
But that's pretty funny.
Funny story, still sticking with me. But overall, I'm very happy that you guys are back. This second chance, this new version is super cool. People loved and deeply connected with Proles of the Roundtable, and I'm sure that's not going to change. I hope that this episode gets it out to more people and lets more people know that you all are back in a new way. You've always done really important educational work, and it seems like you're tripling down on that element of it, of really trying to, educate people on these things and bring a principled Marxist voice back to the airwaves. And more principled Marxist voices is always a good thing, especially at this moment of crisis and transition in our society and, in fact, in our entire world. So that's really cool to hear. And let's go ahead and move forward and just get to know more about you, all of you, and your sort of views and your opinions. Of course, this is a Marxist-Leninist and always has been a focused podcast, but just kind of to toss out a question that we can start discussing, what does Marxism mean to you, and what relevance does it have for today's, as I said, rapidly changing world? Yeah, Ray, go ahead.
One of y'all want to take this one first?
You told me to raise my hand, so I raised my hand. If you'll all indulge me to share this kind of cringy origin story, my Marxist villain origin story. I have a background in like wellness and coaching and personal development stuff, and I'm really influenced by Eastern traditions of like meditation and yoga asana.
Nice.
And these tools, they help me a lot. They tremendously positively impacted my life, and they help me examine my beliefs about myself, about the world around me, about what is possible. And they help me to learn to sit with my feelings and to develop healthy habits. And also, like, I met a lot of really cool people doing really good work. But the longer that I spent time in these spaces, right, the more isolated I felt from the people around me. And I guess the larger the chasm grew between what these people said that they believed in and what was important to them and the actions that they actually took. I could talk about that for a really long time, but I won't. All I need to say about that is eventually I started to feel really disillusioned. And I started to feel really conflicted because, like I said, I learned a lot. It really positively impacted my life. And I grew in a lot of really important ways. But I also felt like a lot of the people were just not making any sense. Like a lot of it was bullshit. And a lot of it was really uncomfortable for me. And it felt like I wasn't really allowed to ask questions and I wasn't really allowed to push back. And I took a step back from all of those things, even the things that are sort of like individuated, like yoga asana or meditation. Mm-hmm. And it felt like, even though I wasn't away on a compound somewhere, it felt like I had left a cult. And I lost a lot of really important relationships and I felt really alone. And I was just in a place of like really deep despair. You can hear my voice. I still feel emotional kind of just remembering it. But as I said before, I'm a nerd and I'm a curious person. And I feel like I just always want to be learning new things. And before this period of my life, I lived in Vietnam for several years. And obviously, while I was living there, I traveled a lot and I went to museums and I read some books. But I just found myself really missing Vietnam, really wanting to go back, or at the very least to feel connected to that place in some way and to learn more about it. And so I started reading about Ho Chi Minh, like the man, the historical figure, not the city. And as I was reading about Ho Chi Minh, I got to a part in a book that I think is on both of our podcasts, where Ho Chi Minh first comes into contact with the work of Lenin. Mm. And he's standing on the furniture in his hotel room and he's pontificating and he's delivering these grandiose speeches. And I started to feel really curious, like, who's this Lenin guy? I know it's like super embarrassing now, but this was years ago and I didn't know. And so I started reading Lenin again, because I just had free time and I needed to focus my attention on something that was not my life, that I had just like burned down essentially. And I'm reading Lenin. I feel so cringe saying this, but it is the honest to goodness truth. I'm reading Lenin and I'm like, holy shit, this guy is like, this guy's a life coach. This Lenin guy, he talks to you in this way that reminds you of your humanity. He activates something in you that lets you remember that you get to be a part of a more beautiful and more just world, and allows you to orient yourself. And so here I am reading Lenin, reading Marx, reading Rosa Luxemburg, reading more of the work of Ho Chi Minh, reading Stalin. And I was like, these guys fucking get it. Not the neoliberal washed girl boss spaces that I was spending time in. The image of a world, of a future that you guys are putting forth, that is abundance. That is manifestation. I know these words are super cringe. It was like a light bulb moment for me to connect these concepts that I had really tried to contemplate in these other spaces that somebody was showing to me. And I share all of that because, well, it's really fucking embarrassing, but I feel like maybe somebody else is in a similar situation and that will clarify something for someone. But also because I think that those of us, I know, Breht, this is something that you talk about a lot, who have a sort of, I don't know how to say, like a propensity toward seekership. I think that those of us with that tendency, we're always sort of looking, whether it's right or wrong or it exists or it doesn't, we're all sort of looking for this, like a theory of everything, right? Something that just makes everything make sense. And in my experience, you know, like Marxism is the closest that I've ever come to that. And Marxism, to me, the importance that it still has is that it allows us, again, to remember that a more sustainable, more just, truly abundant world is not only possible, but it starts to give us the steps to orient ourselves in that direction. And that's like really cringe and embarrassing, but it is my honest answer.
Yeah, it's not cringe at all. I think it's genuinely beautiful, and it resonates deeply with me as well. I mean, the whole reason I'm into these politics is because of a love of humanity and a genuine wish for all human beings to live in a better state, in a better world without exploitation, oppression, etc. So I think that is a profound point. Tony?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ray. That was great. So from my perspective, and I think it's quite similar to Ray's in the sense that I understand Marxism to be essentially a diagnostic tool for like better understanding the world in a material way so that we can, you know, take the appropriate actions to fix it or to change it or to improve it. You know, for me personally, one of the reasons I was drawn into Marxism was through my own experiences of racism. And through Marxism, I was better using Marxist tools, Marxist analysis. I was better able to understand not only my own experiences of racism, but kind of the historical and the ongoing systemic problems as well. And this is in contrast, of course, to how liberalism generally is seen as the answer to combating or addressing racism in our world today. But that is quite a flawed approach, because using liberalism, using that lens, tends to erase certain realities, right? For example, it doesn't take into account things like class struggle. It doesn't look at the relations to production that we have. It doesn't look at class consciousness or even class collaboration. Liberalism also, when it attempts to analyze racism, it generally individualizes it. It puts its emergence and maintenance to being some sort of lack of education. Like, people are only racist, or racist things only happen because we just haven't been taught enough, or that it's some ethereal concept of hate that, you know, pushes it forward, or individual bias, or really that it's typified by some sort of outburst of meanness towards people of color, like something verbal or even physical, like, say, for example, the murder of George Floyd. And this is all true, of course, but this takes away from presenting racism as it most truly manifests, which is the real systemic material deprivation of people of color. So say, for example, a Marxist analysis of racism looks at the emergence of racism, or locates the emergence of racism to the emergence of capitalism in its very early phase of primitive accumulation. which ongoing at the same time as this primitive accumulation, of course, was the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of African people as well, and many other peoples across the world. So through this lens of class struggle, we get a better understanding of why racism even exists in the first place, because it becomes very clear by looking at those who first promoted these ideas, the bourgeois, the landowners, the wealthy landowners, the colonists, that it was a very specific tool to sow division between the working class of Black people, of Europeans, of indigenous peoples as well, to separate us into these separate racial categories to better exploit us and to prevent us also from unifying to rise up against this emergent capitalist class, specifically in the British settler colonial projects in what is today the USA. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that this is a much better analysis than saying, well, people just need to learn not to hate each other, right? That there's a real class-centered push which is behind racism in our society. The other point I quickly want to make as well is that liberalism, as opposed to Marxism, really distorts the way we understand history, and I'll use the history of racism as another example as well. We all know Rosa Parks, of course, right? She sat on the bus. She was courageous. She stood up against racism. And the way that normally gets presented to us is that it was an individual action and was just essentially a moment of bravery on her part. Mm-hmm. When the reality is that it was a premeditated act that was supported by an entire political organization that was set on dismantling segregation as it existed in the South, right? Like there are pamphlets ready to be printed once they heard that she had been arrested, right? Liberalism erases all of this, communal effort, collective effort to dismantle racism, puts it all on one person. And it erases also Rosa Parks's incredible, work that she's done, not only for the working class, but specifically she investigated sexual crimes against Black women in the South, right? Liberalism has a tendency to just erase things that try to, how do I put this? It erases things that point us towards a collective solution to problems and puts it all in the individual. So yeah, that's how I view Marxism. It's a tool to not only better understand history, but to better understand and figure out solutions to the problems that we face today.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether that's poverty, unemployment, even mental health, a million other things, racism, it tries to individualize, personalize the issues and shift you away from a systemic analysis. It's kind of like we all joke on the radical left about the John Oliver effect, where he's pointing out all of the problems of society but never bringing them together, the underlying cause, which is the exploitative nature of capitalism itself. And that's, I think it's a perfect distillation of progressive liberalism, in the sense that John Oliver is ostensibly a progressive person that is actually correct about some of these issues, but never ever bringing them together to show like the system itself is at fault. It's always this bad guy or this shitty company or this weird thing. It's not, the underlying mechanisms that has, its hand around our throat for centuries. Jeremy?
Yeah, and it's always just, contact your representative is a solution, or,
right.
Vote out this bad individual here, and that's not going to help. I guess I don't think I could possibly follow Tony and Ray's answers there with anything that's going to be quite as poignant. But I will say, to kind of synthesize these two things, these two perspectives, Ray mentioned looking for a theory that explains everything and how Marxism fits that bill. I spent quite a lot of time in academia trying to do something that never really came to fruition, but they hate these grand theories. The social sciences really, they have abandoned trying to look for grand theories or accept grand theories for everything. They want very focused, narrow research on very particular topics. And, whether that's like an intentional thing, and I think it is, and there's problems with the academy that cause this, that push in that direction, which I'm not going to get into because we'll be here for like an hour. But or whether it's some kind of conspiracy doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is that this has the knock-on effect of people situating their research and therefore the results of that research in narrow chasms of ideology that never connect to the bigger picture. And that is, when you're studying racism, you don't study the problem of racism generally. You study how government policy in Venezuela meant to help ethnic minorities actually hurts them, which is a paper that was published and was on the road when I was in academia at the time. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and of course it's Venezuela, so that's why it gets all of this airspace and detracts from probably much more interesting and important work. But yeah, I don't know.
Absolutely. Well, moving on to the next question, those were wonderful answers, and I completely agree with all of it. The systematic analysis, a theory of how the world actually operates, a theory of how societies evolve over time and the sort of laws of motion that enable those movements, and a deep critique of liberalism from the left, because regardless of any other detail, the fact is liberalism has a sort of ideological hegemony on the world right now, and people don't often think outside of its confines. And to have a left, more progressive, deeper understanding of the world from a revolutionary Marxist perspective has always been nipping at the heels of liberalism, has always been condemning its hypocrisies, showing everybody else the ways in which it pretends to be one thing but actually facilitates others. Liberals and liberalism wants to present itself as progressive, as, liberation from all forms of tyranny, particularly state tyranny. But it has no critique of capitalism itself. It has no critique of imperialism itself. It has international relations theories, and there's theory. There's the Marxist theory. There's the liberal theory. There's this theory. There's the realist theory, etc. But it's very limited, and I think it's bumping up against its historical limitations more broadly. I don't know if we're seeing the end of liberalism writ large currently, but I think we are seeing an interesting crisis period within globalized liberalism, not just globalized capitalism or imperialism, but the very ideology of liberalism itself, and it's going to be fascinating how it plays out. But moving on to the next question, this is something that is kind of more personal, but I think it is something that is worth talking about because I think of Marxism and I think of socialism and communism as this beautiful human tradition full of like deep, meaningful, passionate, loving human beings. Not that all of them weren't flawed, not that there aren't issues or problems, not that people didn't make mistakes, but that we look back over our tradition and we see again and again across space and time in different cultures, genuinely beautiful human beings way ahead of their time, trying to produce a better world for themselves. And I think that's an important aspect that, the center and the right and liberalism and fascism and reactionary versions of all kinds of ideologies constantly shitting on Marxism, constantly just saying it's all about tyranny. The Marxists just want power so they can step on you. It's just big government, etc. We're bombarded with that 24/7, but any of us in the know understand that this actually is a beautifully human tradition. And so in line with that sentiment, I'm just curious as to, for each of you, who are some of the comrades or the thinkers or the revolutionaries in the past and within this tradition that you personally relate to or draw the most inspiration from?
So I can take this one first. So the Haitian revolutionaries is what I'm going to say. And so for those that may not know, this is a group of mostly formerly enslaved African people who rose up and defeated empires, like empires with a plural. And this happened on the island, which is now known as Haiti, from roughly 1791 to 1804. And so these group of formerly enslaved people, they beat the most technologically advanced societies at the time. They beat the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire against all odds, against conventional wisdom, producing really what I guess could be considered one of the first victories against emergent capitalism at the time. And of course, if we want to get to specific people, there are the well-known names, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint Louverture, Cecil Fatiman, but what most inspires me, the comrades that I get the most inspiration from, are those unnamed persons who will never know their names, will never know their faces, will never know their stories, but that mass of people who were radically optimistic in the moment. They're radically motivated, and they're radically ready to participate in this necessary revolution. You know, how can that just not be inspirational? Not only just for Black people, of course, but for everyone, I think. And in the wider story of the revolution as well, there's so many lessons or things to take note of. Like, say, for example, the French, when in their attempt to retake the island from the revolutionaries, they hired about several thousand Polish mercenaries to help them retake the island. And so these Polish mercenaries, they came with the hope that if they were to come fight for France, France would then help them with their own fight for Polish independence. Because as we all know, Poland throughout history is constantly being recreated, reshaped, reformed. So their hope was that France would help them after they helped them retake the island. And what ended up happening when the Polish people got there is that they were like, hey, wait a second. You told us that this was supposed to be capturing prisoners that had escaped, not a slave uprising. So the French had actually lied to them to get them to the island. Not only had they lied to them, but they ended up treating them like shit while they were there. So many of these Polish mercenaries actually switched sides and joined the Haitian revolutionaries. So they joined this revolution on the side of people who, you know, they probably didn't speak the same language, or maybe they shared French in common, and they didn't have the same culture, the same backgrounds, the same even class position, right? But they knew that they had a common cause and a solidarity, which was, you know, overcame any kind of difference that they had. And still to this day, there are Polish Haitian descendants who live on the island. The other thing I wanted to bring up about Haiti in terms of comrades that I draw the most inspiration from is the fact that Haiti was an early example of anti-imperialism, at least from a state itself. So soon after the establishment of Free Haiti, their government actually ended up providing material aid to Simon Bolivar, who is well known in South America as being a liberator of South American countries from the Spanish Empire. And so Haiti, despite being a country that was constantly under siege and still is to this day, being in a very precarious position, they still provided Simon Bolivar these material, money, weapons, etc., with the promise that Bolivar would use these resources to abolish slavery in the places in South America that he ended up liberating. And so, fortunately, Bolivar didn't do that exactly everywhere he went, but Haiti definitely helped start a domino effect, which led to the end of slavery as existed in South America. And like Haiti in this position really makes me think of Cuba, right? Cuba just being constantly under siege, being pulled in 1,000 different directions, yet still sending aid to Southern Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And helping destroy and dismantle apartheid there. And the last thing I want to mention too was that, these revolutionaries are not only inspiring to me, and I'm sure many other people around the world, they're particularly influential with the philosopher Hegel's conception of the master-slave dialectic. Because I believe this revolution was either happening at the same time he was coming up with this or before, actually. And as I'm sure, Breht, your listeners know, Hegel was an incredible influence on the philosophies of Marx and through that Marxism, mm-hmm. that these revolutionaries, this mostly unnamed mass of people who took up arms for their freedom, have had a dramatic impact on all progressive movements today, whether people know it or not.
A beautiful answer, and I truly love that you emphasize the nameless, faceless people who have fought and died to advance the ball for humanity in these various struggles and continue to. I think the most Marxist answer to that question is precisely to get away from the great man theory and to get into the masses themselves, because there is no socialist or communist revolution in the history of humanity that is not backed and supported and made possible by the masses themselves rising up in their own interest and fighting valiantly, even though most of them, 99.9%, are never remembered in our history books. So, beautiful answer. Who wants to go next?
Once again, and every day of my life, as is reflected in our group chat, I am reminded that the people that I work with are just so fucking smart. Aren't they so outrageously smart?
Absolutely.
Rather than, taking this in the direction of specific revolutionaries, because Breht, I think that what you said, if I'm remembering correctly, is beautiful human beings way ahead of their time trying to better themselves in the world or something like that. Mm-hmm. And as you said that, it brought to mind someone that, doesn't come up much on the left podcast chariot. And that is Maria Montessori. And whether or not, I agree with, every idea she ever had or endorse all of those things, it's very clear that Marxism is an enormous influence, and not covertly, I mean, overtly. She talked about the communizing of what was largely women's work and the hope that this would catalyze opportunities to communize more unseen and underappreciated labor. And I'm reminded through that example that the front line of struggle can be and literally is absolutely everywhere, every single facet of life. Maybe also to that end, in addition to Maria Montessori, I have a background. I studied acting. And so like Paulo Freire, author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed and that kind of work, the work of Brecht, things like that. Again, not necessarily something that I absolutely agree with or think was always inherently amazing and successful, but those who had the audacity to be influenced by this worldview, this theory, these theories, and to approach other areas of life, other areas of struggle, and to reclaim them for those of us on the left, or to try to repurpose things like education, things like entertainment, the arts, our understanding of knowledge production, culture, so many areas, and to try to reimagine them, to creatively sort of reimagine them in an image that is more aligned to a world that is less oppressive and less violent. And I find myself really inspired by that. And I think that so many of us can really revere and honor those who participate in armed struggle. And then I know for me, sitting on this side of middling aged in this specific body with the limitations that I have, or for other people who have concerns with their body's ability, or maybe they have young children, or maybe it's an immigration concern or whatever it is, feeling like, oh, that pathway is not available to me, and therefore maybe I don't have a place in revolutionary action. And so I also think it's important to remind myself, and maybe anyone else who's listening, to stay inspired by those who do the thing that you do, but in a way that you would more like to do it.
Well said. Jeremy?
Very good. I'm going to have a very boring answer, but Rosa Luxemburg was very important to me in terms of my political development. In about 2014 or 15, I was still more or less calling myself a libertarian socialist, which, I don't really know what that means, but that's what I was calling myself. And yeah, and I read Reform or Revolution, and I was like, wow, this is such a concise way to express a very complicated and very multi-layered issue. And as soon as I finished reading it, I bought this book, this enormous book. It's called The Letters of Rosa Luxemburg. And I kind of went through kind of dates that I knew were important. I looked at, what was going on after she got arrested? What were her letters like there? And then I was like, okay, well, what were her thoughts on the Russian Revolution? So I went back to 1917, and she had a letter that I'm trying to remember who she was writing to. I believe it might have been Clara Zetkin, but the letter more or less said, we must believe and understand within ourselves that the capitalist press is never going to give the Bolsheviks their fair due. They are likely to lie. But even if every salacious thing they are printing is true, we have to give them our critical support because they are trying to do something that has never been done before in the entire fucking history of the world. And I was like, shit, man, that's a good point. And like the concept of critical support is something that gets thrown around a lot on the left, particularly amongst Marxist Leninists. But for me, that was a new concept. Like the thought that like, okay, maybe they did go too far. Maybe they did make mistakes, but they were putting into practice something that had never been tried before, ever. And if you're doing something for the first time, you're probably going to fuck up sometimes, but that doesn't mean you throw the whole project out. And so, yeah, that was a big deal to me. And it kind of put me on the path toward, where I am now.
That's great. Yeah, all those answers were absolutely wonderful. I put down 3 people that stand out to me, not to put them above anybody else or to say that they're objectively better than everybody else, but just that have had the biggest impact on me. And those are Rosa Luxemburg, Che, and Malcolm X. Malcolm X, I just love his dignity, his utter fearlessness, the integrity. He carried himself with such integrity, with such, take no shit from anybody. I think I've made this argument in our Malcolm X episode. You can draw a straight line from Malcolm X to the birth of hip hop in its black love, self-love, the refusal to bow down to mainstream white society and to often fly in its face. He was so controversial to white America, and in the end, he knew he was a dead man walking. Not only was he like a family man who took care of his family, but he knew that standing up for his people in the precise way that he was meant a death sentence, and he said as much leading up to the days before he was assassinated. All 3 of these figures, Malcolm, Che, and Rosa, all died brutally. At the hands of assassinators. Rosa was killed by members of the Freikorps, who would eventually were like basically proto-Nazis. And, we have many episodes on Rosa. If you're listening to this and aren't familiar with the story of Rosa Luxemburg, I highly recommend you check those out because of her, among many other things, her dripping humanity. She was a tiny Jewish disabled woman who was a firebrand and who was, just a top tier thinker and organizer. And she died for the cause that all of us are trying to advance. On my personal Instagram is her quote, one of the quotes I love the most and which speaks to Rosa's humanity. She says, "I am at home in the entire world, wherever there are clouds and birds and human tears." And if you go into her journals, her letters to the people in her life, not only did she have this amazing politics, these really principled Marxist politics, but she was just so alive to every dimension of being a human being. Every dimension of existing as a sentient, self-aware creature in the cosmos. And she was in a dark time. And I always found that incredibly inspiring. And then, of course, Che, just putting his whole life on the line, being genuinely moved by injustice, and to this day being a universal global symbol of revolution, of resistance, of liberation. And yeah, the liberals and the right wing, they mock the idea of Che t-shirts or whatever, but they mock it because it's such a potent fucking symbol. And underneath that symbol is the real human being, Che Guevara, who literally dedicated his entire life to revolution and liberation. And you can't help but just be in awe of people like Malcolm, Che, and Rosa. But yeah, all great answers, and I'm sure you ask 100 different Marxists, they'll come up with different answers. There's plenty of other people we could mention, but moving forward, and I want to ask this question in the spirit of humility, right? This is not meant to be, let me tell you what's wrong with the left, but we should wrestle with criticisms. We should think deeply about the ways in which, we are not quite up to snuff. Obviously we have a lot of fucking work to do. If you look around, it's pretty obvious. So with that humility in mind, I ask this question to all of you. What primary criticisms do you have of the revolutionary left in North America broadly? And what aspects of it do you see as the most promising, perhaps?
So something which we were engaged in quite a lot in the first run of Proles Pod was we quite often spent significant amounts of time attacking other leftists. And I think that's not incredibly productive to do for a few reasons. One, if you are attempting to win somebody over to your side, if you shit on them, they're not likely to join you. Two, if your idea is the best idea, go out and talk to people who are not political and convince them that you are in the right. Go out and talk to liberals, go out and talk to conservatives, go out and talk to libertarians. Like, the left is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the total population in the West, particularly in the United States. We're at maximum, like a few 100,000 people. Maybe a couple million if you get really, really diffuse in your definition of the left. But that's nothing as compared to the overall, 380 million people who live here. So maybe spend less time arguing amongst ourselves and more time out in the streets talking to people who are not currently of the left and convincing them to join the left. And it is a hard road because, and I think this is maybe another criticism. I think a lot of people are feeling defeated by the conditions of the United States and the West and the world at large, in terms of there's not a lot of revolutionary potential here, as far as we can tell. And so people are latching on to what I would consider to be extremely retrograde ideas right now, trying to appeal to the worst in amongst the working class, kind of the most socially conservative or reactionary positions, and going, well, if I adopt those positions, then I can speak to them, and maybe that'll develop a revolutionary consciousness. But I think that's I think that you're basically flip-flopping two things. You are going, there is no revolutionary potential. The working class is socially, a lot of the work, and not even the whole working class, a lot of the working class is socially reactionary. I'm going to adopt those positions, rather than going, the issue is class, and we need to speak to people on a class level. The fact that multiple layers of the working class have these beliefs is irrelevant to their position in class hierarchy. But again, I think these things are related. You're attacking other leftists to appeal to people who aren't even interested in what you have to sell.
Yeah, Tony.
Yeah, so my answer is actually kind of a variant of what Jeremy just had said there. But essentially, one criticism that I would have, humbly of course, is that there is a lack of intellectual and material engagement with actually existing socialist countries in a way that really, I think, separates like North American socialists from this grander, wider heritage of socialism that exists. And that means that we miss out on lessons that we could be using in our organizing here or in our theory development here. It means we miss out on forming international solidarity with comrades who are perhaps further along the struggle than we are here. And that essentially means that we're missing out on socialist construction that's occurring across the world, and which could be occurring here in North America as well. A few years back, I went to, I believe it's called a Marxist summer school, and it was held at a local university. And I was like, this is going to be sweet. I attended it. And they had different speakers throughout the day, different conversations, a lot of dedicated comrades and socialists that were there. But unfortunately, a lot of the discussions that were had were targeted at critiquing socialist countries, more so actually than critiquing capitalism within Canada itself, which I thought was quite shocking. So listeners, I implore you to engage with socialist countries, and there's a variety of ways that you can do this. I know a lot of different socialist countries, such as China, Cuba, they have solidarity trips that they offer throughout the year. In your city, you may have a local organization which puts out something like that. I implore people to join if they're able to. You can get engaged with political work that targets removing sanctions from socialist countries, such as Cuba. That is quite a big thing now. There's, of course, a big push to get Cuba removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list, which is incredibly important. And all this can be buttressed by just personal education, reading more books about socialist countries, listening to podcasts, doing whatever to further educate yourself, not only for your kind of your own development and nourishment, but also so that you can go out there and help counter misinformation that is just rampant on social media, which is rampant on cable news, which is rampant in the workplace, which is rampant everywhere, right? You can engage in that work of countering misinformation, because all this is important, because the problems that they are facing are problems that we are also facing too, or will face once we get further along with our socialist development here. And I think in doing so, I think that is really the materialist approach, is taking in all that information of what is actually being constructed by socialists around the world and trying to implement that here, and to build those solidarity links for the betterment of all of us, really. Because this history that is not only for past socialist countries, but current ones today, their experience is our experience. We're all trying to do the same thing here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, incredibly well said. Jeremy's point of this element of the ostensible left trying to tail reactionaries and take on board chauvinistic, shitty, bigoted, backward opinions in hopes of appealing to a certain segment of, the working class is obviously a failure, and it's just not going to work, for a million different reasons. It's deeply alienating to people who are the most oppressed and who stand to gain the most from society, and also splits up the working class, because the working class is multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, of all different gender identities and expressions, etc. And so to start bringing in bigotry is just, and if you look at these movements, they're all very often disproportionately represented as like young white men, and that's no accident. You alienate basically everybody else. And then Tony's wonderful point about internationalism and just the humility, the curiosity, the willingness to learn from actually other countries who are going through the struggles themselves, instead of sitting back relatively comfortably in the imperial core and casting aspersions or thinking that your theoretical critique of this or that global south country has any relevance other than just solidifying the imperial core narratives and ideologies themselves. I am always disgusted when I see people take, instead of a humble, willing to learn, curious approach, this condemnatory, I've read all the books, let me tell you, people in this country or that country how to do socialism. It's revolting, and it's hubristic, it's pure ego, and it's unnecessary, and it hurts everything. It hurts the cause locally and abroad. Ray, did you have anything to add to that?
So, though, again, as I said, I'm American. I am not always in North America, although obviously I do engage with English language media primarily online. And so, just speaking to that, I feel like I've made the joke so many times, right? Like with friends like these, who needs COINTELPRO? And just to remind ourselves that the internet could be a neutral tool, but it's not. And it's molded by capital, and it's molded by billionaires and oligarchs who make their money by extracting our pain and our rage and sort of like farming that and extracting that from our bodies and our minds. And to just remind ourselves that the internet and social media obviously are powerful tools, and we have to constantly fight against what they are and how they try to force us or contort us to show up, right? And really do things that bring shame to ourselves and really showcase the worst of ourselves, our humanity, and our movement. And so I think it's worth reflecting on what the platforms are, how to use them effectively, and also make a friend. I know that this isn't directly a criticism, but maybe more of just a suggestion. I think it's okay to want to exchange the memes about the tendency that's not yours and to make jokes about this person or that person, but like not on the internet for everyone in the whole world. Just to echo what all three of you have said, it's very disheartening. It makes people feel scared or unwelcome. Just make friends, get friends. Get friends, get a friend, get a hobby.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever we're on the internet and on these social media apps, we are inherently on the enemy's terrain. These multi-billionaires and these huge corporations that own these things and that harvest our data, and it's going out into the entire world. And there's a lot of people across. I mean, this is not just to the left. This is a political thing across the entire spectrum, right, left, and center, who mistake being active online as real activism, real organization. I mean, there are certainly things that being online can help. It can bring people together. You can learn things. I mean, without the internet, like, being out here in the middle of Nebraska, what are the odds that I would have fully been able to understand and grasp and think about things like Marxism and communism? I was reading books and stuff, but yeah, there's online communities that helped me a lot in my development. So there are positive elements of it, but if you're spending hours and hours a day, if you're disconnected from people in your actual life, then it really becomes a problem. And again, you see that across the entire political spectrum. It's not just a problem on the left, but it obviously hurts to see it on the left as well. So all really important things to think about for people listening. The next question I want to ask is, the original way I was going to frame this question is, which country in the world today is carrying the torch of socialism in the most promising way? But rather than just making it like, what country do you think is doing it the best, I just want to ask you, is there a certain country you want to highlight? Like, what country would you like to highlight as like carrying forward either a socialist ideal or an anti-imperialist ideal or an anti-colonial ideal in a way that is worth studying and learning from?
Yeah, so I'm not the most educated on this country, but given recent events, so we're recording this the day after the failed coup in Bolivia. And so kind of going off that common Twitter meme that's been used for China as of late, I'll say this. There are incredible things happening in Bolivia.
Absolutely.
The current organization of the Bolivian economy, of course, is not socialist in the sense one could say China is, or Cuba's, or even what the Soviet Union was back in the day. But the governing party for the past 20 years has been socialist oriented, and has been their main goal is to build towards socialism. And really what I wanted to kind of point out here is that during the coup itself, the Bolivia's Trade Union Confederation, I believe it's COB is the acronym, as this coup was ongoing, as this military leader was storming the gates of the palace, as military troops were out in that plaza, this trade union confederation, the president, had called for an immediate mobilization and a general strike in response to what was happening to ensure that democracy would be upheld in Bolivia. And I believe this confederation consists of like at least 2 million workers, peasants of all sorts across the country. And they came out in mass to support the president, Luis Arce, I believe his name is. They came out in mass to support him, but most importantly, to support the building of socialism in their country. And it was such a wonderful thing to see that kind of mass politics that doesn't, we don't necessarily see mass politics like this in North America, for example, of people coming out on the streets to defend socialist construction, right? We might see things like January 6th, for example, but I don't think if, say, for example, Biden was overthrown or whatever, that we'd see liberals, Democrats out in mass to support it, right? So, yeah, I just wanted to make that point that Bolivia is definitely a place to keep your eye open towards. Currently, of course, it is experiencing economic hardship, mostly as a result of rebounding from COVID. But the achievements that they've made in the past 20 years really are remarkable, and I think an example to the world.
I completely agree. I echo that sentiment. And the connection with the indigenous community in particular, I think, has really been the backbone of that entire movement, which is, something we should all learn from. Absolutely.
I am really excited by a lot of what's going on in the PRC in China. It is incredible in terms of technological development that's going on. It's incredible in terms of The elimination of extreme poverty has been accomplished. The gap between rich and poor is shrinking in China. They just put a cap on bankers' salaries. It's like, and I know that a bunch of ultras are going to be like, oh, caps on bankers' salaries, how socialist. But I'm going to say what was said to me when I said a similar thing, probably about a decade ago. China is on a 100-year trajectory. And the fact that we think in economic quarters or in 5-year plans, or, which China still does 5-year plans, but my
4-year election cycles.
Yes, or 4-year election cycles. We are very in the West, I think, fixated on rapid change and development, and if we don't see that, then we're not happy. But again, China is on a long path, which it has continued down since its beginning. There have been setbacks, the Sino-Soviet split, the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of these things had negative impacts that caused them to have to change their trajectory, but never have they abandoned socialism. I mean, there are way more co-ops there than there are in the West. There are way more collective farms there than there are in the West. So even if you believe that socialism is those things and nothing else, they've got that. But anyway, the China is killing it. I mean, they are pretty close, I think, to getting nuclear fusion to be an actual sustainable source of power. They probably have eliminated or figured out a way to eliminate diabetes, which is unbelievable as well. Like these are developments that would never happen in the West because they are not economically profitable. To eliminate diabetes as opposed to selling insulin for $1,000 a dose or whatever. It's exciting to me. And the fact that they are consistently undermining the United States and its allies is also very exciting. We may be seeing, as you mentioned earlier, sort of the cracks in the neoliberal order that may cause a fracture.
Mm. Yeah, one of the things I always say about China is, like, regardless of what you think about it, in the U.S., the state is subservient to corporations and their power, and in China, corporations and the private sector are subservient to the state. And they're doing big things. They're eating America's lunch. They are presenting themselves as the responsible player on the world stage, as the U.S. backs the genocide in Gaza, as the U.S. backs this proxy war in Ukraine. This bullshit about the international rules-based order that the U.S. always likes to advance. China's just calling their number over and over and over again, and it's going to be very interesting to see where they go. The one thing I do have to promote is our recent it's a 4-part series on the last 250 years of Chinese history with professor and scholar Ken Hammond. And we released it in 4 installments, going all the way back to the Taiping and Boxer rebellions, up to modern-day China, the Deng reforms, the Cultural Revolution, all of that stuff, the Long March. And if you haven't heard that yet, it's a collaboration I did with Guerrilla History, the last thing we sort of did together as I was parting ways with those comrades. But if you haven't heard that yet, it's over 8 hours of a deep dive into Chinese history with a really engaging and really knowledgeable scholar. So I highly recommend people check that out. Regardless of your position on modern-day China, like, you will learn so much, as I did interviewing Ken. But Ray, do you have anything to add to this?
Yes. First, I want to zoom out a little bit from the singular nation state and remind Westerners especially that it is vitally important that we, as they say, pivot to Asia to examine not only the variety of socialist experiments that happen in Asia, right? Primarily the former Soviet Union, China, Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea, but to also, it's the only example that we have globally for how socialist countries and now former socialist countries interact with one another. And for Westerners who maybe don't know, who aren't familiar, and of course it's really challenging because there isn't always something accurate and solid and reliable to consistently read in English, although I know China has been making strides in order to make a lot of their stuff available for non-Chinese speakers. but that's just like a general area of interest, right? Of all of us, obviously, we're communist history podcasters, but I think that there's so much that we can learn from their collective example and both mistakes that were made and progress that is really exciting and interesting, and decades of information that we can look to understand more mature in terms of like their longevity projects. And how they interact with one another. I really do look to Vietnam as an example. As I said, I used to live there. It's my favorite country in the world. And I think that they're often forgotten about in a lot of these conversations. But, just for based things that are happening in Vietnam, yes, I could talk about, they had the largest growing middle class for, I think, 6 consecutive years or something like that. But, they recently also sentenced a billionaire to death for fraud. So
nice.
Cool things happening, and then after kind of that zoom out, when I'm looking for things that feel really alive or that feel really interesting, sometimes I feel less inspired by individual nation states just because the scope of that can feel so overwhelming to me. And I feel a lot more connected to, obviously, like smaller pockets of disruption. And in this really difficult and intense time, I look to people who are trying, for example, to unionize their workplace for the first time, to people who are showing up to protest for the first time, obviously the student encampments and people coming together against the violence of Zionism and imperialism globally. And sometimes I just remind myself again that we are, as we all, because actually, Brett, I just want to circle back because I think the last question you asked, if I'm remembering correctly, you asked for criticism and then you also asked for what we felt hopeful about or something to that effect. Yeah. And we all tried to dance around and not be super critical, which I think was the right move on all of our parts. We were very kind, but none of us really engaged with what made us feel hopeful. And that kind of just reminds me, right, that we're so acculturated to focus on the negative, and it's important to train ourselves anywhere. And maybe it is, China is developing a cure for type 2 diabetes. Maybe that's something that I can look to and go, wow, that's so incredible. That's so inspiring. I feel so hopeful about that. Here's an example. And I think that there are other places as well that we can look. And, on Proles Pod, we have an upcoming episode about an Indigenous community, or several Indigenous communities, but it focuses primarily on one Indigenous community in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And also reminding myself that Marxism is an aperture through which we can view other things. And we don't have to use it to feel inspired by or to see actually socialism or Marxism or anti-capitalism happening, even in groups of people who don't self-identify as being socialist. And so I don't know if that is a good answer to the question.
Yeah.
No,
but to be fair, Tony took mine and I wanted to do an episode on Bolivia, and I want that documented. I want everybody to know.
Noted.
Forgive me.
I suppose like on the front of like things I'm hopeful about, like people who in the past I have had arguments with, one in particular, I tend to post a lot about the terrible things that go on in the United States. And one of my friends who I've known for like 20 years was like, there's nothing we can do about this. Just like have a good time, just party, like just let's just all get drunk. Let's get high, chill, quit complaining about this stuff. And she is now like free Palestine, and this was, we're only talking about like 2 years. So I think people are developing, if not class consciousness, then at least a consciousness of the position of the United States as an imperialist power globally and how shitty it is. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm hopeful about that. I'm hopeful about the political consciousness that seems to be developing in people who even very recently were completely devoid of it.
I totally agree, and it is worth stressing the positives and the reasons for hope. And like I think Palestine in particular and the Palestinian resistance has really brought this issue to the forefront in such a powerful, globalized way that it's even penetrating the ideology of the imperial core to the point where they are scrambling, genuinely in fear of the monumental shift in public opinion against Israel and in favor of Palestine. And the Palestinian resistance, the armed resistance itself, is the movement that put this issue back on the global map. They were ready to, Israel, the U.S., the entire region was ready to just quietly and silently shuffle off the Palestinian question as they were starting to make deeper ties regionally, Israel, with Saudi Arabia and these other countries in the area. And the armed resistance and the uprising of October 7th really put this entire issue back on the map, and has been brutal to see the response by the U.S. and Israel. Absolutely fucking disgusting, genocidal, criminal. But at the same exact time, it's revealed the rot at the center of Israeli society and American society. And it's really shifting perspectives in a way that you saw happen before the fall of South African apartheid. You saw very similar shifts in public opinion, even in the imperial core, while the governments of Israel, the UK, the US were still firmly trying to maintain, their support of apartheid South Africa. And eventually it was just globally and internally too much for them to resist, and we've seen apartheid fail. And now problems still exist in South Africa. The legacy doesn't just go away overnight, for sure. But there is reason for hope, and we have to, every human being across the world interested in decolonization, interested in liberation, interested in a better future for all of humanity, have to pause and tip their cap to the Palestinian resistance. And the Palestinian people themselves, who have persevered through tragedy after tragedy, brutalization after brutalization, and have maintained their humanity the whole way. They are the shining example of the human species, the best we have to offer. And I think Israel's time is coming to an end. And it's because of the Palestinian resistance that's happening. And I think the U.S. imperial hegemonic rule is taking, at the very least, a fatal or terminally fatal blow, if not the end of U.S. imperial hegemony, in large part because of Palestinian resistance. So it's always worth highlighting the Palestinian people and their dignity and their bravery and their perseverance. And I also want to highlight, lots of stuff is happening in Africa. In particular, Burkina Faso remains a wonderful source of inspiration for people around the world. The new leader, Captain Ibrahim, is really, picking up the spirit of Thomas Sankara and genuinely picking up his torch and carrying it forward in a really beautiful way. And I'm really keeping my eyes on that country in particular, but that entire area, that region and the continent itself, to see what happens in the next several years to decades, because it seems around the world, and particularly in the global south, there has been a revolution in consciousness, at least, and a material revolution in some specific countries across the global south that are just saying enough is enough. And I'm really excited to see where those developments go. But all wonderful answers, and I really appreciate that. So we have a couple more questions for you today, and now I want to shift a focus back to the United States. I know Tony and Ray are not necessarily living here, but certainly you're affected by U.S. policy. You're affected by U.S. politics. I'm sure you're very aware of it, against your will and wishes perhaps, but unfortunately being the global hegemon, even the dying global hegemon, means everybody has to have their face shoved in the shit of American politics. So with that in mind, what are the fundamental divides and crises in the United States in particular today? And where do each of you see things going in the next couple of years? And of course, you don't have to restrain your analysis merely to the United States. Canada and even Mexico, lots of changes are happening currently as well. So what are your thoughts on the fundamental divides and this ongoing crisis that we seem to be living through?
I have concerns that what is much more likely than a socialist revolution in this country is a fascist one. And it is what will likely happen if that does transpire, if there is some sort of a localized fascist uprising, is that the neoliberal state will attempt to defend itself, in spite of the fact that it does sort of tacitly provide support to fascists and fascism because it would much prefer that to socialism or communism. It does not want fascism as its primary means of defending capitalism, and that may be an opportunity when the state is fighting a common enemy with us. That may be our opportunity. But I think what we really need to be doing in this time is to start building networks of solidarity so that we can feed one another and take care of one another and protect one another should the worst happen. And maybe I'm wrong, but that is my fear.
Yeah, and it's not just the U.S., it's across the entire Western world of this rise in fascist movements.
I agree with everything that Jeremy said, and would add to that and double down that even if, by the way, we get the opportunity for the revolution of all of our dreams, the alternate networks of care that need to be in place stretch so broad and so deep and in so many facets of our lives that I think it's really challenging to even conceptualize. So whether things go as bad as we fear or as well as we could hope, the path forward for our cause is the same. And it is to do what we can to strengthen communities and networks of care that pose, at least in some small ways, to be alternatives to the existing system that we have. And again, kind of what we were all touching on earlier about people of different tendencies needing to find common cause with one another. This is an area that revolutionary Marx-Leninists and other communists and anarchists really all have in common, right? There's a period of time where it is of vital importance that we're building things that counter what currently exists. Because yes, it's so exciting to take control and to abolish the systems that are oppressing the majority of us so much. But if there's nothing left in place, we're really setting ourselves up for a tragic failure. And I think my biggest fear is that those alternatives are not going to be in place at the tipping point that, that Jeremy was kind of touching on before, where it's like, yeah, there's a point where we can go one way or the other. Obviously, material reality is not so binary, but just in broad strokes, there are always sort of tipping points or turning moments that you can go one way or the other. And either way, the work in front of us, in my mind, is largely the same.
Yeah. We desperately need means of growing our own food that does not depend on the current supply chains that we have. That's a very vital thing that we need to be able to feed ourselves, and we don't have anything like that.
Proles Pod Prepper Cast.
Well, no, more so than Prepper. Like, we need to be able to share. We need to be able to grow enough to feed not ourselves, but hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, and we have nothing like that. So even if we were ready tomorrow for the revolution, it would, we don't have a means to feed our army.
Yeah, that's the basis of dual power. Tony, go ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. So to kind of add on to what everyone was saying here, establishing these networks of solidarity within the country, of course, and within our communities. But back to a point I made earlier in regards to creating these solidarity networks with socialist countries around the world who have experienced similar things, who may have this knowledge that we've talked about growing food for thousands of people when you might not have the resources or the most advanced technologies to do so. And they may be the ones coming to our aid when we need it. So again, right now, building these solidarities within our own communities, but also facing internationally and across the world as well for those working class links.
Yeah, absolutely. My friend and good comrade, Professor Alexander Avinia, recently shared a quote from the newer Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, who made this point about the broader crisis within the imperial core centered around anti-immigration policies. The quote is, "This immense exodus will have a response in the North. We are already seeing it in the anti-immigration policies of rich countries and the rise of the extreme right within them. Hitler is knocking on the European and American middle-class homes' doors, and many are letting him in. The exodus will be responded to with a lot of violence and barbarism. What we are seeing in Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. And I think that the idea of Hitler knocking on the doors of the imperial core is poetic and scary, but also this idea that what we're seeing in Gaza is a rehearsal for the future, I think is a very fascinating and worthwhile point to reflect on, because Israel in so many ways is the front and center, because it has to be based on its settler, colonial, and apartheid status, of this systematic, hyper-technological 21st century apparatus of repression. And as conditions become shittier in the imperial core, as climate change bears down on all of us, as the rich and the powerful refuse to hand over an ounce of money or power or compromise in any way, the neoliberal leaders and the centrist policies and the corporations that back a lot of these governments are hyper aware that they can't keep this going forever, that eventually it's going to sort of, the rabble are going to start picking up pitchforks. And what they have in store for us is cop cities. What they have in store for us in the most extreme instance, because I don't want to water down or act like what's happening in Palestine is some normal thing that's going to be inflicted on all of us. What the Palestinians are going through is uniquely horrific. But we see what the colonialist, imperialist apparatus has in store for the masses when they do eventually, whether or not they do, but if and when they do decide to rise up, what they have in store for us. And I thought that was incredibly on point and just really highlights the importance of our task domestically and globally, because there are people in every single country, on every corner of the populated world that believe what we believe, that want a better world, that want to fight for something different than what the fuck is on offer. And the powers that be are not simply, and they never have in history, simply hand over, power and wealth when we come knocking. So it's going to be a struggle, and we really have to be prepared for that materially, organizationally, and even psychologically. So I do have one or two more questions before we wrap up here. And this one is I don't know, it just came to me and I thought it was kind of interesting. You don't hear a lot about this. None of us are perfect. We all have things we can work on, but it is interesting to think about what set of traits that are important for people who do believe in a better world, for revolutionaries of various stripes to cultivate within themselves. Sometimes it really makes me frustrated when the right wing acts like it has a sort of hegemony on things like discipline, on things like loyalty, on things like honor. And they act like, the left is inherently disloyal, unhonorable, undisciplined, etc. And of course, centrist his hysterics feed into this with working out is fascist or whatever, discipline is fascist, whatever. Just this real widespread confusion amongst people about certain traits and certain stereotypes about the left. So with all of that in mind, what do you think are some important traits in individuals who are dedicated to building a better world that it is worthwhile actively trying to cultivate?
Yeah, to speak to a lot of what you just said, Breht, I don't think that we on the left should or can afford to cede an iota of ground when it comes to, as you said, things like morality. I think that the left should really stop shying away from conversations, for example, about the family, about fitness and health. I think it gets reduced, and anyone trying to suggest that we should work to improve ourselves, we're automatically classist or ableist, or as you said, conflated with fascism. And all of these things are things that well-rounded people need to live a good life, but they're also things that people vitally need in order to participate with and for the revolutionary cause. Another thing that I think people need to pick up on a thread that Jeremy mentioned earlier, the neoliberal world order asks us to individuate, to isolate, and to become increasingly niched or specific with our work. Echo chambers in our lives, the media that we consume everywhere in our lives becomes, even though we have the internet, even though we have access to more information than we've ever had before, simultaneously narrower and narrower and more isolated and more individuated. And we need to counter that with well-roundedness. So if you have a strong knowledge, for example, of theory, but you lack emotional regulation skills or conflict de-escalation skills, if you're just a shitty, unpleasant person to be around, you should fix that. You need to develop those skills. If you have a lot of ability with engineering or with plumbing or with marketing, right? The revolution might not be televised, but it sure as fuck is going to be propagandized. Whatever skills you have, double down on them, be great at them, and also work really hard to become a well-rounded individual. Another thing that I don't think we talk about enough, especially in North America, but Tony, it touches on a lot of what you said. If you only speak one language, do what you can to try to become a multilingual person. When we look at Marx, Stalin, Uncle Ho, they were all polyglots. They were all multilingual people, not just basic hola, como estas conversations. These are people who were writing theory, delivering speeches in not their native language. So these skills are vitally worth your time. When we look at places like, as I said before, North Korea, China, Laos, Vietnam, an enormous reason that those countries are so hard for us to understand is because we don't speak or read those languages. And it's really, really, really important that, of course, people who have the time, people who have the discretionary income, but also I'm thinking about Uncle Ho riding around the world cooking and washing dishes on a boat and learning Russian, right? And learning French. Well, he learned French in school, but learning other languages and coming back and doing theory in those languages. You know, as we're doing the Stalin series, you see time and time and time again, this critique of Stalin and his writing and speaking without anyone stopping to be like, that is his second language. So that's something that I just think is really, really, really undervalued. And I guess the last thing that I think is really important that we all develop is to unhook from ourselves the violence and the poison of neoliberalism. And one of the ways to do that is just to remind ourselves and each other all the time that no one is disposable. We haven't really talked a lot about the damage and the harm that sort of cancel culture and wreckerism has done to most spaces, but especially in this case, in this conversation, to the left. We are not disposable. And if you meet a person from whether it's another communist who has a different tendency than you, or just like a liberal who's starting to question what's going on at their office, anyone who's willing to challenge capitalism is worth your time. And I think it's funny, right, that as like communists, we're largely very interested in history. And, you know, to kind of joke about what you guys were saying earlier, we tend to have like a very short memory when it comes to our own political development. Right now, You're the revolutionary Marxist-Leninist. But hey, some of the people listening thought Obama was going to save America, right? So it's important that we're really patient and we meet other people where they are. And anyone who has already taken a step, because the propaganda is so strong. The capitalist world order is the oxygen we breathe. Literally, it's the microplastics in our balls. It's the water we swim in. And anyone who has stopped to be like, how did that get there? Are people worthy of our respect, our time, our patience, and our dignity? So I think it's worth it if I said, you know, what qualities does a revolutionary need to have? It is being patient, being open, staying human, because this is a human movement for the betterment of humanity.
Ray, yeah. I cannot agree more, and you got my heart rate up in the best way. I agree with every syllable that you said right there. I have people in my life, and my family, and my friends. I mean, I live in fucking Nebraska, so, you know, I have conservatives, I have liberals, I have people all across the spectrum. They're all fed up. They're all working class. They're all fed up. They have different interpretations. First and foremost, they like and respect me as a human being, and that allows me the doorway in to give my views. If it was some random person on the internet or some random asshole at work or somebody they just didn't like or respect, they would completely shut me out. But because they know me as a human being, because I've made human connections with the people in my life and my community, I have a doorway in to express what many people see as these radical, scary politics, but which makes sense when you actually talk to regular people about their regular lives and you point out all the ways in which, you know, working people at home and abroad are brutalized by this system. So I think everything you said there was absolutely spot on. Jeremy or Tony?
Ray, earlier you had said that, you know, the other members of the Proles Pod are super smart. Well, I just want to say that what you just said was incredibly powerful and moving, so thank you for that.
Absolutely.
There's very little that I have to add to what you said, but one thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is something I learned listening to Rev Left over the years, is being open to learn from anyone who has something useful to say, regardless of their specific, say, for example, tendency on the left, or even if they're not socialists or leftists at all. Because, whatever, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. Marxist-Leninists, unfortunately, don't hold the sum total of all knowledge, right? So there's so much that we can learn from each other and from other people. And it's something that I've really also had to wrestle with working on the Stalin series, which we've kind of teased at the start, right? A lot of the research that we're doing, of course, is from mostly liberal scholars, right? And I may not agree with maybe their certain takes on things, but they've done a lot of archival research. They've, learned the languages. They've done all the work that I can't do and likely never would be able to. But there's so much knowledge to gain from them, regardless of their own specific political outlook. So I just wanted to make that point.
Absolutely. Well said. Jeremy?
And I would say that you cannot, sort of kind of piggybacking on what Ray said regarding like people don't remember their own political development, but also even further than that, you cannot expect people who grew up in this country or in the West in general under the education system that we have, with the values which are important in these countries, to have the correct line on everything. And they will quite often hold retrograde opinions. And so I guess, again, calling back to my oblique reference to the fucking patriotic socialists that I was talking about before, they're not wrong that like a lot of the left goes, oh shit, these people are socially backward, I'm not going to talk to them. You have to, y'all. You have to make connections with these people, because we're not going to have a revolution if like 1/10 of 1% of us is a Marxist-Leninist. You're going to need to make connections to people who are not currently politically conscious, who are not class conscious, and you have to make them that way. And part of dealing with that situation is to listen to them say stuff that is wrong and backwards and fucked up. And I'm not asking people who are from marginalized communities to put up with bigotry, but if you are like a white dude and you hear somebody say some shit that's fucked up, you go, hey man, that's like, you're off base here. You're focused on the wrong shit, and start guiding them in the right direction. But like this broadly can apply to multiple, not just white guys. Like it's not like white guys have a monopoly on bad ideas or shitty opinions. What I'm saying is basically you need to be open to these people. You don't need to accept what they have to say, but you do need to make connections with them so that when the time is right, you can sow seeds of putting them on the correct path. Like I have a very specific example. My youngest daughter's best friend, her father is like a Republican, and he also smokes like dab though, so he's like a weird libertarian-ish Republican. But anyway, I was at his house. Yeah, I was at his house at a party, and he starts complaining about trans women in sports, right? But he doesn't actually give a shit, right? Like that's not a thing that affects him in any meaningful way. He has no connection to women's sports. Mm-hmm. He doesn't watch or care about women's sports. He's just been told to care about this by reactionary media sources, right? Mm-hmm. And I knew that one response I could be like, you know what, fuck you, dude. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. You're a transphobe. Or I could hit him with all the standard talking points, being a trans woman doesn't necessarily make you better than a cis woman at a particular sport, blah, 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 blah. But instead, I went around him and I went, why do we divide sports by gender anyway? Why don't we do it based on skill level? And like took him aback. It kind of like it shook him loose from his fucking thought process. And he was like, yeah, why do we separate sports by gender? And I was like, I think because there are some women out there who would kick some dudes' asses, and that would make them very insecure. And he was like, you know what? You're right. He's like, I ride motocross, and there's this 13-year-old girl who she like kicks everybody's ass out there. Why, and that's like, but you just have to, engage with these people. You have to like listen to them, hear them through, and then redirect them in a like disconnect them from their ideology. And it allows you then inroads to plant more seeds and change people's minds. But you can't change people's minds unless you talk to them first.
That's a great example. And yeah, you hear that shit a lot. And he was programmed to respond to the normal shit that maybe somebody, a liberal would say. And then you hit him with a totally new thing that made him like sort of, recast a question mark on his entire thing. Even if he doesn't fully connect the dots in that moment, you've sort of, found a weakness in his overall ideology and put a question mark there that he now has to contemplate. But overall, you didn't just cut him off. You didn't do the Pat Sock reactionary MAGA communism thing where you take his bullshit on board, and you didn't do the liberal thing where you just like, you're an irredeemable piece of shit, I hate you, fuck you. You did the principled thing of trying to meet him as a human being, understanding kind of where he's coming from, not taking a step backwards on the humanity of trans people in general, while also hitting him from an angle that he wasn't quite expecting, but engaging with him, right? And that's the thing that I think is important. We're never going to get anywhere if we just say fuck everybody that's not completely caught up to where we're caught up. To Ray's point earlier about, we all have these moments of evolution, and we all come from somewhere, and we all have to learn some way. Yeah, that's true. And so be the force of education and enlightenment and progress, not the smug liberal or the reactionary tailist. And I think that's the balance beam that we have to walk. But cutting people off and deeming them as irredeemable, it doesn't help anybody, and it just solidifies stereotypes about who they think we are. So those were all really, really.
And I would also say,
go ahead.
I would also say that like I used to be very afraid to talk about being a socialist or a communist or a Marxist Leninist, because I was worried that people would hear that and then just like stop talking to me, be like, wow, this guy's like way out there. He likes Stalin. But people really don't care. They treat you initially almost as like a novelty, but eventually they start asking you questions. So like, don't be afraid to talk to your coworkers or your friends like about your political views. They may be like, whoa, but they're also going to ask you then follow-up questions after their initial sort of surprise that you're willing to just sort of come out and say it. Like, don't be afraid to talk to people. Like, please, it's not as scary as it seems.
Yeah, more than I've never been shunned by anybody or anything like that. More than I've had like begrudging respect, or like people say, hey, I don't agree with everything Breht says, but he knows what he's talking about. He's a smart guy. He has valid opinions. I might not agree with them. That's what I get from coworkers, from people in my friends and family group. I've never once had anybody be like, oh, he's so far out there, I'm not listening to him. Because again, you have those human connections in real life that people aren't willing to just cut off for no reason. And so you build up a certain level of respect. They know me as a father, as a brother, as a, son-in-law or whatever. And then I also have these opinions, and they respect me enough to at least hear me out. And I think, making those human connections and just presenting the humanity, right? Because like you were saying, like, if people have never come across a communist, a Marxist, a socialist, they have all these stereotypes about them. But when it's their brother or the guy they work with who they like, or the dude they drink beers with and shoot pool with on the weekends or whatever, it humanizes actually the entire ideology. So the next time that they hear communism, Marxism, socialism, they don't think super scary big government tyranny. They think Tony or Ray or Jeremy or Breht. And that automatically is a win for us. And it advances our cause. Ray, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I also want to just underline something that you already said, Breht, about the value of the human connection. And I guess I can't emphasize enough how strongly I feel about reminding people that we are people. And it's not about meeting people so that we can build a connection, so that I can sell them on my communism any more than it is about selling them on my religion or selling them on my business or whatever it is. Being sold to feels like shit because it's shitty, even if what you're selling is of value. And I feel like, just to remind people listening, that if you don't love people, and believe me, I mean, you're seeing the best of us right now. We all live in a group chat together where we're sewer trolls, right? So sometimes it's so hard to love people. But if you don't love people, human beings, more than human beings, the environment, the planet, if you don't love, revolutionary thought and action will not be sustainable for you, and it will not be successful in changing the hearts and minds of other people.
Well said. Tony?
Yeah, further to what Ray said, I just want to, what she said made me think of this Che Guevara quote, and I just looked it up here, and he said, I believe this was during an interview he did when he was visiting the U.S., and he said that, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the perfect summation of everything I think that we're talking about and really honestly standing for. And I too absolutely love that quote. Well, but before we wrap up here, first thing I have to say is it's really worth noting that you guys are a really great team. Like, you all have unique perspectives and you place your emphasis on slightly different aspects of the tradition and the thought, but in a way that really is coherent and comes together to mutually reinforce one another. And it just makes for a really good and well-rounded team. So, if you're listening to this, go right now, subscribe to Proles Pod, support them, check them out, listen to their episodes. You won't regret it, and I think this is a perfect introduction for anybody who haven't heard of you or may have forgotten about, Proles of the Roundtable and didn't know that you were back. The perfect representation of the new version of Proles Pod, and I absolutely love it. I fully support it. Highly, highly encourage everybody listening to go support them, subscribe to them, follow, and listen to them. Before I do,
and if you sign up for the highest tier of our Patreon, we will give you the key to our end of the world bunker.
Ooh,
yeah,
so that's a great.
You're gonna make it.
That's great. I'm going to sign up for that, But no, seriously, go support them, check them out, subscribe to them for sure. Before I move into the last question about where people can find you and the socials and everything, I do want to emphasize this really cool thing that you've sort of introduced now with the relaunch of Proles Pod, which is Theory Beats. Can you kind of explain to people what Theory Beats is, and maybe also my editor can put in a little clip, a little example of what Theory Beats is, because I think it's a really cool and unique idea.
I kind of wish Justin was here for this one, because it's kind of his baby. He got the idea from listening to Tony on Actually Existing Socialism, where he had kind of this the meme, the lo-fi hip-hop beats to study/relax to, or whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. He was speaking over it, and Justin was like, what would be a really good idea is to take sections of theory and put it over hip-hop beats. So it's like a music bed that sort of helps to tune out everything else around you and allows you to focus on the words that are being said, like you're listening to a song. And so far, we've put out 3 different sections of Foundations of Leninism by Stalin, but we're going to shift into other things as soon as that's done. Tony, did you have something to add?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that I'm pretty sure that it was a reading of Stalin, and it was on the nationalities question, I think it was, and I think that's what inspired him.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's really cool. I listened to it. I loved it. I was mowing my yard and had my headphones in with like these ear protectors over it, so I was fully immersed. It's a really cool thing, and you actually do kind of you hang in there more. You listen to it more than if it was just a pure audio, pure podcast, pure talking. There's something about that background music that sort of locks your attention in a really interesting way. So I can't believe nobody's thought about it before. It's a really great idea.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And Justin is making those beats, by the way. They are his creation as well. They're not like, we're not finding He is DJ
Justin.
DTA, death to America. It's yeah.
DJ DTA. I love
But yeah, like it's impressive, honestly. Like we're not using open source stuff. We're not like paying somebody else to do it. He's making them all, which is pretty cool.
Super impressive. Shout out to Justin.
And it's similar. Apologies.
Go ahead.
And it's similar to the broader projects related to the study guide that we talked about at the top. When we think about it now, and we think about pamphlets or newspapers or the ways that propaganda was circulating in generations past, we take it for granted. But in fact, those things were novel transmissions of information and media. And it is our responsibility to continue to make things engaging and accessible for people, as well as find ways that they will be interested, that they can retain information, and that they can learn in different ways. And so that's also part of kind of our broader project right now, which is to be like, how can we get people like me, frankly, who really are interested in the subject, but for whatever reason are having a difficulty understanding it with the way that it's often presented. And so it's sort of part of a broader, I guess, project, educational project.
Super cool. I fully support it. I absolutely love it. Check out Proles Pod. Check out the Theory Beats. Check out Actually Existing Socialism. Before I let you guys go, can you let listeners know where they can find you, your show, maybe your personal accounts online, etc.?
It's mostly at Proles Pod. So between the first iteration of Proles and this one, I have shifted from being extremely online to being extremely offline. Nice. So sadly, I'm no longer a meme lord. But mostly it's at Proles Pod. We have a Libsyn. We have obviously.
But please email us at
yes.
prolespod@outlook.com and tell Jeremy to each according to his ability. I don't make the rules, Jeremy. The people need your memes.
My brain doesn't even think that way anymore. I don't know if it's sad or if it's great, but either way, I don't know. Maybe I'll get back into it and I'll just be depressed. But at this point, my memeing has fallen off pretty hard.
Well, I'll link to Proles Pod socials. I'll link to the email so people can reach out, give feedback, ask any questions they might have, etc. I'll link to Actually Existing Socialism. Is there anything else that you would like me to link to in the show notes?
No, I guess I should just say that if you'd like to follow the work at Actually Existing Socialism, my Twitter is at AES the podcast.
AES the podcast. All right, I'll link to that.
We were just joking before we recorded that Tony would have to mention AES like multiple times because he's gonna leave us when he gets tired and just do his solo projects like a lead singer leaving a band.
Yeah, we might have a One Direction style breakup.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I can't believe I gave you Beyonce and Stevie Nicks, and you still went for One Direction.
One Direction, come on, One Direction.
So I guess it's worth noting, I still do coaching things, obviously, from a Marx-Leninist perspective. And you can just reach me at the Proles Pod email if anybody's listening, and I can give you the information for that just manually, I guess, if that's something that's of interest to anyone.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll link to all that in the show notes. Go support Actually Existing Socialism. Go subscribe to Proles Pod, etc. Really exciting to have you guys back. Thank you guys so much for coming on the show, sharing your knowledge, sharing your insights. And I really look forward to seeing how Proles Pod goes from here.
Thanks, Brett.
Cool. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
To Theory Beats. This is an adaptation of Foundations of Leninism by Joseph Stalin, beginning with the historical roots of Leninism. Leninism emerged and matured in an era of imperialism, a time when capitalism's internal contradictions had intensified to their breaking point. The proletarian revolution had transformed from a distant prospect into an urgent reality. The period of preparing the working class for revolution had concluded, giving way to a new phase, a direct assault on capitalism itself. Lenin labeled imperialism moribund capitalism due to its exacerbation of capitalism's inherent contradictions. pushing them to their absolute limits, beyond which revolution becomes inevitable. Among these contradictions, 3 stand out as particularly significant. The first is the conflict between labor and capital. In industrialized nations, imperialism manifests as the unchecked dominance of monopolistic trusts, syndicates, banks, and financial oligarchies. Traditional working-class tools, trade unions, cooperatives, parliamentary parties, and legislative action have proven utterly insufficient against this overwhelming power. Imperialism confronts the proletariat with a stark choice: submit to capital and continue a life of hardship, or embrace new methods of resistance. It is imperialism itself that propels the working class towards revolution. The second contradiction lies in the rivalry among financial groups and imperialist powers vying for raw materials and foreign territories. Imperialism drives the export of capital to resource-rich regions, fueling a relentless struggle for monopolistic control. This conflict intensifies as emerging financial groups and powers challenge established ones for their place in the sun. Notably, this contest inevitably escalates into imperialist wars aimed at seizing foreign lands. These wars, in turn, weaken the imperialists collectively, undermine capitalism's overall position, and hasten the advent of the proletarian revolution, rendering it a practical necessity. The third contradiction arises between a small number of civilized ruling nations and the vast populations of colonized and dependent countries. Imperialism subjects hundreds of millions to the most blatant exploitation and brutal oppression, with the sole aim of extracting exorbitant profits. However, this very exploitation compels the imperialists to construct infrastructure in these countries: railways, factories, mills, and commercial centers. Consequently, a proletarian class emerges. A native intelligentsia develops. National consciousness awakens, and liberation movements arise. The burgeoning revolutionary movements in these regions clearly attest to this process. This is crucial for the proletariat, as it fundamentally weakens capitalism by transforming colonies and dependent nations from reserves of imperialist power into reserves of revolutionary potential. In essence, these are the primary contradictions of imperialism that have transformed the once flourishing capitalism into a system in decline. The imperialist war that erupted a decade ago was significant in that it concentrated these contradictions into a single focal point, accelerating and facilitating the proletariat's revolutionary struggles. In other words, imperialism not only made revolution practically inevitable, but also created favorable conditions for a direct assault on capitalism's strongholds. This was the global landscape that gave rise to Leninism.